Disclaimer. My work draws heavily upon the works of Carlos Castaneda. While there are few direct quotes, the underlying concepts are drawn from his work. My interpretations of those works are provided to advance my own point of view and in no way constitute a claim to anything that was not created by me. I have no commercial interest in this work. It is provided free for those who might find value in it. I have no connection with Castaneda's estate, nor with any entity, commercial or otherwise, that claims to be connected with Castaneda or with anyone connected to him. I express no opinion on the claims of those who purport to be connected with Castaneda, in the present or in the past.
Lastly, this work should not be construed as in any way condoning, supporting, encouraging, or recommending the use of any dangerous or illegal substance, or the performing of any dangerous or illegal activities. The teaching and research methods depicted in Castaneda's works should be viewed as the result of a unique convergence of time, place, and circumstance, and not as a template that any other person should attempt to follow. Chapter 8, Part 2. A note about terminology. At various times Don Juan used the term warrior. In the interest of keeping things simple and more or less consistent, I've used the term sorcerer. A warrior, in Don Juan's usage, is a person who lives a life that is tight. He or she has few points of leakage of energy. His or her tonal is in good order. However, the term is also applied to persons who have done all of the above and who have been exposed to the Nawal and are, for various reasons, seeking to know more about it. The two terms at times read as interchangeable, but I read the distinction as being that a warrior is one who has cleaned and refined his or her tonal without necessarily seeking the additional knowledge that a sorcerer must have, that is, being guided into and eventually becoming expert in reaching and invoking the Nawal. Theoretically, anyone could become a warrior, simply by changing the way he or she lives, but to learn sorcery as defined by Don Juan and others of his practice of it, requires living like a warrior and being in the right place at the right time, as it were. 1. The teaching of dreaming and stalking. As far as I can tell, stalking was never discussed per se except when Castaneda had been shoved into heightened awareness. Thus he does not discuss it as a structured entity of the teachings until after he began the process of recollecting the long-forgotten instances of having been in heightened awareness. At the same time, Don Juan and his companions always acted like stalkers around Castaneda in all states of awareness, for no other reason than that they would have acted like stalkers at all times regardless. While stalking involves detailed instruction, dreaming, by contrast, involves essentially no instruction. It is all practice. After Don Juan instructed Castaneda to start by looking for his hands in his dreams, he rarely spoke about it with Castaneda, other than the occasional question about how things were going. He would then give Castaneda a few pointers, or suggest life changes to be made in order to resolve the dreaming logjam. But there were no precise instructions or guidelines to follow. Footnote 1. Once, in another context, Don Juan told Castaneda that in terms of dealing with the Nawal, he himself was in really no better position than Castaneda was. His only advantage was that he knew how to get to the Nawal on his own, whereas Castaneda yet didn't have that knowledge. But that once the Nawal was reached, Don Juan had no greater intrinsic facility or knowledge in that realm than Castaneda did. I had always considered this a teaching maneuver on Don Juan's part, to help Castaneda feel better when progress was slow. I think now, however, that Don Juan was being literal, and dreaming, being an aspect of the Nawal, was one of those areas where Don Juan didn't have much to say to Carlos about what to do in dreaming, once the basic mechanics had been mastered. By contrast, stalking deals extensively with people and situations, that is, the essence of the tonal. Thus, there are volumes to say about the how and what of stalking.
2. Some speculations about seeing. I mentioned above that while stalking is perfected by the consistent application of detailed techniques, and that dreaming is perfected by a combination of tuning one's luminous body and faithful practice, seeing is something that a sorcerer is simply at a certain point able to do, as the result of following the dictates of one's teacher and consistently applying them to his or her life. As such, is seeing something that is simply at the student's disposal, to be used volitionally as the student desires. Or is it always on, and needs to be turned off in order to view the world normally? Clearly the latter can't be the case. Living a normal life in such a state would be next to impossible, and in any case Don Juan's own words contradict that. At one point, Don Juan describes to Castaneda an incident that occurred some years earlier. Don Juan's son was working construction, building a section of the Pan American Highway, when he was buried by an avalanche of rocks. Don Juan was close enough to arrive at the scene before his son died, and he relates to Castaneda that instead of just looking at him there, he shifted his eyes and saw his son's death. He saw the cluster of feelings that make up the true nature of a human being come apart, the force of life no longer holding them together, and they drifted away, like the beads of a broken necklace, in his words. Footnote 2. There are references, here and there, to various members of Don Juan's family. In general, I think these references are not strictly factual, at least not in biological terms. At one point Castaneda describes Don Juan talking about falling into the role of husband and father to a woman and her 2 children. Lucio, described as Don Juan's grandson, is known to Castaneda. There is a mention of a daughter-in-law, at one point, and so on. This may all be factual, or Castaneda may have deliberately obscured some information, or Don Juan was obscuring his personal history to Castaneda, or it was part of a teaching trick. In at least one instance Don Juan presented one woman as Pablito's mother, and 4 others as Pablito's sisters, when in fact none of the 5, all sorceresses, were related to one another, or to Pablito. That all 5, and Pablito, lived in the arrangement as though they were mother and 5 children is testament to the discipline of warriors, and to the importance of the maneuver to Don Juan's overall plan for Castaneda.
Clearly then, seeing is volitional, at least the overt visual aspect of it, where one is capable of perceiving the luminous bodies of living things, etc. But what of the aspects that are concerned with feelings, as when Castaneda saw in the park in Mexico City, and knew that that man's problem was that the man drank too much? In that instance, Castaneda had to stop, focus, and make an effort, as per Don Juan's prodding. Would a more accomplished sorcerer not have to do that? Again, thinking about it, if the spigot is always on, as it were, that would seem to be tremendously invasive, just as it would be with the visual aspect. Imagine walking down a busy street and being bombarded with a continuous stream of insights about the people all around you, on top of the normal load of stimuli one would already be processing normally: sights, sounds, traffic, signals, our own thoughts and worries, etc. It's hard not to imagine that not being crushingly chaotic. So if seeing is volitional, how and when it is employed? What determines how and when to see instead of merely looking? Don Juan used it to aid his teaching, using seeing to know certain memories Castaneda would then have to remember on his own, as with the albino falcon. He used it at a time of great stress and sadness, when his son was killed. What other times might it have been used? Was there any practical limit other than one's own comfort and ability to process everything? As ludicrous as it sounds, do sorcerers see for fun? Or for the hell of it? It's impossible to say, of course. Yet many of the pranks that Don Juan and Don Gennaro played on Castaneda seem at least partially based on their intimate knowledge of his personality and quirks, and it's reasonable to assume that at least some of that knowledge was the result of seeing. That doesn't prove anything in and of itself, of course, but I think it lends itself to an interpretation that seeing becomes inextricably part of a sorcerer's being, and it is used in a variety of situations, grave, serious, and not so serious. B. Seeing for Castaneda is something that seemed particularly difficult to attain. Whether Don Juan's trick of making seeing a goal in and of itself made it more difficult, I don't know. Perhaps Castaneda was simply more hard-headed, viewing everything through the Western, scientific perspective. Whatever the reason, Castaneda's seeing experiences always happened under the influence of another person or situation. In some instances, it was simple prodding by Don Juan, as in the episode in the park in Mexico City, referred to above. In at least one other instance it was a directed exercise conducted by Don Juan, wherein Castaneda was able to see people not physically present. In another, Castaneda saw with a woman named La Gorda, a member of his own party. Obviously there's no way to know if Castaneda's experience is typical or universal, with so little to go on. And while seeing is something that just happens, I think the following are reasonable conclusions. 1. The process of learning to see is going to vary widely by individual, both in form and in timing. At one point, Don Juan says that Pablito, an apprentice of Don Gennaro's, and Eligio, a very newly found apprentice, both already see, even though according to Don Juan, their lives aren't as tight as Castaneda's. This could have been purely a motivational tactic on Don Juan's part, but my guess is that it wasn't solely that. 2. As with any activity that one eventually gains skill or mastery at, there is the so-called aha moment, when big chunks fall into place, seemingly at once. There was such a moment for Castaneda, a true statement, but one which on the surface has no huge implications, is delivered at the perfect moment, and everything falls into place, and from that moment on Castaneda was able to see at will, by, as Don Juan had described it, shifting his eyes. Footnote 3. This happened right before the end of the apprenticeship, and in a state of heightened awareness, meaning Castaneda didn't remember the moment, and presumably the technique, until some years later.